From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So I'm here to introduce a man who has the unusual distinction of having made a career of failure, and a very successful career at that. Professor Henry Petroski's academic expertise is in what's called failure analysis, the process of collecting and analyzing data to determine what caused something to go wrong, which is one of the things that first drew me to his work. 9 years ago this month, after 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center and a third into the Pentagon, I telephoned Professor Petroski from the post offices and asked him about what had just happened. What about those structures had worked and what had failed, I wanted to know, and what could we learn from that? The following week, in the Sunday Outlook section of the Post, he wrote from an engineer's perspective about the impact at 2 different sites in 2 different cities, one with its buildings arranged vertically in celebration of America's towering supremacy, the other horizontally, crouched symbolically in defense. And he wrote about the effect those disasters might have on the future of building design. With characteristic foresight, he wrote, "The Pentagon will likely be restored to its full geometry long before any decision is made about what to do with the land on which the World Trade Center once stood." The ability to breathe interest into the objects that surround us, from great engineering feats of our age like the Twin Towers, to the most mundane of objects, memorably the pencil and the toothpick, has characterized Petroski's work. He's a prolific writer, the author of 15 popular books, as well as numerous articles and reviews, some of which we've run in the Post. Last year, a particularly provocative article ran under the headline, "Want to engineer real change? Don't ask a scientist." Most people who aren't scientists or engineers seem to think that science and engineering are the same thing, he wrote. They're not. Science seeks to understand the world as it is. Only engineering can change it. And that's what his new book, The Essential Engineer, is all about. The role that engineering, and not science, can play in responding to the great global threats we face, from climate change to producing clean and renewable energy. He even suggests that science can sometimes get in the way of technological change. I'm going to invite him to tell us how and why. Henry Petroski has been widely recognized for his academic and literary accomplishments, not only in his own field of civil engineering, but also through fellowships in such august bodies as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. He's the Aleksandar Vesic Professor of Civil Engineering and a Professor of History at Duke University, and the author most recently, as I said, of The Essential Engineer. And here is The Essential Engineer, Professor Henry Petroski.
Thank you, Francis. That was a very nice introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I've been enjoying the day, even though it is a little warm for me. Francis made a very good summary of my book, and I'd like to elaborate on some of the things that she said. There is, I think, an incomplete understanding of the difference between science and engineering, between scientists and engineers. It's sometimes reflected in the mass media, where engineers are just grouped with scientists. This is not, absolutely speaking, incorrect, but it loses some of the fine distinctions between the 2 professions. During the space race back in the late 50s and early 60s, there was a great need to develop a lot of different rockets to achieve what we wanted to achieve then in our battle or competition with the Soviet Union. So it was news on a regular basis to report on whether test firings of rockets were successes or failures. When they were successes, the headlines often read, "New science achieves new record of thrust," or some such thing. attributing the success to science and by implication to scientists. When there was a failure, when a rocket failed to ignite, it was a dud, or when a rocket did begin to take off but then went astray, the headlines more often than not read something to the effect that latest rocket test, great engineering failure. And engineers, obviously me included, really tell that story over and over again, and they think it summarizes the difference in the way scientists and engineers are treated. It has a lot of implications, not only for how they're treated or how they're perceived to be treated, but also the status that they're held in. And this book that that's just been published is largely about issues like that. The fact of the matter is, as Francis indicated, there are distinctions between scientists and engineers, and the general way these distinctions are framed is to say that scientists study what is originally the given universe. Scientists are interested in the planets, the stars, the origins of the universe, how old is the universe. Questions like that are truly scientific questions. But of course, scientists have also been interested in what are the laws of physics, what are the laws of nature. They look not only to the cosmos, but also down into the atomic level. And generally speaking, the principal objective of science is knowledge, understanding, facts, measurements. Engineering, on the other hand, as again Francis indicated, seeks to change the world. Engineers, the profession of engineering, would like to develop better systems of air conditioning tents in the hot summer, or I guess we're in the fall now. But and I guess they get a lot of support for that, judging from that response. But historically, there has been a lot of engineering that was done, believe it or not, without much of a contribution from science. It's a fallacy, and it's a very significant fallacy that you take the results of science and you just do something to them, and then you get engineering. In reality, it doesn't work quite that easily. This is sometimes called the linear model, that you make scientific discoveries and then by some process, which is seldom really elaborated upon, there comes an engineering outcome. And again, it's like the attribution of the successes to the scientists and the failures to the engineers. In the history of science, history of technology, there are a lot of very, I think, convincing examples that it just isn't so simple. The steam engine, for example, that was developed in the late 17th century for a very practical purpose, and this is characteristic of engineering, that there's a purpose to what engineers do, not just to understand, but to produce something, to accomplish an invention or a new development in technology. And in the late 17th century, the purpose was to pump water out of mines. It was hard to mine coal if the coal mine was full of water. So the steam engine had that and only that purpose originally. Throughout the 18th century, it was developed to be a much more versatile machine. And of course, when we get to the 19th century, the steam engine was put on wheels, and the wheels put on tracks, and we had the railroad. So this steam engine, which is symbolic of the whole Industrial Revolution, really revolutionized the way we not only experience transportation, but also, by extension, how we experienced society and culture. It was only after, really, the railroads had gotten started that scientists seriously began to look at the steam engine, because now it was something that existed. It could be an object of study in its own right, and it was out of that came a science that we call thermodynamics, or the motion of heat. the fact of the matter is that the steam engine was developed with virtually no science. Another, I think, very persuasive example is what the Wright brothers tried to achieve, namely powered flight. The Wright brothers recognized when they were trying to design and build their flying machine that they had to know somehow what shape to make the propeller. What would be the actual curve of the propeller, and also the wings were important, but the propeller particularly vexed them. And they even wrote to the Smithsonian Institution here on the mall asking for scientific results that would help them develop an airplane. Well, the answer they got back was there was a paucity of really information. And what did the Wright brothers do? Well, they didn't say, well, we can't go on and do engineering because we haven't done the scientific foundations. They proceeded to do it themselves. The Wright brothers experimented with different shapes and came up with the shape of the propeller that they used. In engineering, you don't have to have the perfect answer. You have to have an answer that works. And when they achieved that, they were satisfied because they had a lot of other things to do too. So the airplane, which again revolutionized transportation in the 20th century this time, was truly an engineering achievement. The engineers welcomed all the science they could get, but there just wasn't much in the beginning. It was only after the airplane was demonstrated to be effective that true aerodynamics, the science, was developed. Now, so what this suggests, this little story, is that engineering and science may be separate, but there are overlaps, and furthermore, engineers can actually do science, and they often have to, in order to proceed, in order to achieve their objective. Because when you're trying to develop something, whether it be a steam engine or a flying machine, you evidently reach a point in your pursuit where you just don't know enough. So you do have to get some more knowledge. But generally speaking, it's of such a practical kind that it hasn't interested science, and the engineers have to do the science themselves. Scientists also can and do engineering. Some people argue that a lot of modern science especially really wouldn't be getting very far if it weren't for the engineering that produces the machines and the devices that accelerate particles to unheard of speeds and energies. But let me tell a little story about Albert Einstein. Nobody will deny that he was a scientist of the first rank. It's generally known that Albert Einstein worked in the patent office when he was young. It's less generally known that the reason he did that is he couldn't get an academic job as a scientist. But he eventually, of course, did publish significant papers. He published them while he was working in the patent office, and those brought him all sorts of recognition. The publishing papers in science is reporting on, the facts, the knowledge that has been learned by the experiments or the program that was pursued. But what's less widely known about Albert Einstein is that he was also interested in invention. He was not only interested in it through his work at the patent office, but he was interested in inventing himself. And he was interested not only in inventing, but also patenting his inventions, and patenting his inventions because he was interested in profiting from his inventions. And this is also a characteristic of engineering. Sometimes it's very difficult to separate invention from engineering. Back in the 1920s, after Albert Einstein had earned his Nobel Prize or won his Nobel Prize, one of the big practical problems that the world faced was with electric refrigerators. They were new at the time, but they had one big fault or flaw. Well, actually two. They had motors and they had compressors, but they were noisy. So refrigerators were noisy. That was one thing, but that's something you can live with. There was a more deadly problem with refrigerators, and that was that all the noise, all the vibration associated with the motor and the compressor shook up the system, and it developed cracks and developed leaks, and that meant that the refrigerant that was being used could escape. At the time, the refrigerant that was being used was poisonous. So if a refrigerator sprung a leak in the middle of the night and a family was sleeping and it wasn't detected, then there would be a real tragedy. And there were many newspaper stories reporting on such tragedies. Einstein read one of these, so the story goes, and he and his colleague, Leo Szilard, who had a pact, a formal pact about inventing, and that anything they invented together, they would have an understanding of how the proceeds of licensing the patent would be divided. They invented and patented in several countries a refrigerator that didn't have a motor, didn't need a motor. They used the principles of thermodynamics to figure out how to get this refrigerant to course through the system and condense and do whatever it had to do to exchange heat without a motor. And we would probably have those kinds of refrigerators today had it not been for the fact that at the same time the refrigerator manufacturers like, say, General Electric figured out another alternative to this deadly refrigerant problem, and that was develop a new refrigerant that isn't poisonous. And that ended up being Freon. So the refrigerator companies were introducing Freon at the same time that Einstein and Szilard were trying to promote their machine. And by simply changing the refrigerant, that was a lot better and more profitable for the companies than Einstein's invention. And so that was sort of lost in history. But here's a serious scientist doing serious science who could also do engineering. And that shows to me that there's plenty of room for cooperation between and among scientists and engineers. In fact, we hear the term research and development a lot. Research and development roughly to a lot of people means science and engineering. Too often it means that the research is done and then it's handed over to the development people, and there isn't the interaction. So a lot of research and development programs are not as efficient as they might be. These things are very important in the present time because we hear a lot about innovation. The country needs a lot of innovation, which is equated roughly with invention, but it's going beyond invention. It's going not just getting the patent, but also commercializing it, something that Einstein and Szilard were not able to achieve because of the circumstances of the times in which they were working. But innovation brings new industries, brings new ways of life, literally, and also enables things to be achieved that might not otherwise. But how do you achieve innovation? Well, if you listen to some of the politicians in Washington here these days, you achieve innovation by throwing a lot of money at science. And if just call up on Google, you know, these stories reporting on strategies to improve the innovation in our country so that we can improve the economy and therefore hire, you know, have greater employment and so forth in new industries. It's not associated with engineering, it's associated with science. I think this is a short-sighted view, and I think it really fails to appreciate the lessons of history. And I think unless there is a more widespread understanding, especially among those who write the laws and vote on the laws and are involved with public policy, we're not going to see the kind of innovation that we all really want, including the politicians. So coming around to where I started, it shows, I think, that if we really want to get engineers and scientists together, we have to stop separating them in newspaper headlines or in political speeches or in political policies. We have to be serious that we recognize that engineering is a very important contributor to innovation and to the way things are done and will be done. Let me just say one more thing, one more anecdote, and that has to do with the steamship. A lot of these stories have to do with transportation and consumer stuff, because that's so important. That's where innovation is really going to happen. In the early 19th century, steamboats were popular, and they were mostly on rivers, though. And one of the reasons was it was generally the case that these boats that ran on steam, that had steam engines, had to refuel regularly. So they had to be close to a source of fuel, coal or wood or whatever they burned. And of course, if you're near the coast or on a river, that generally is not too hard to do. But the question was, what about transatlantic shipping? What about the sailing ships that would come from, say, England over to Boston or New York? Could you build a steamship that could carry enough coal, let's say, to make that voyage without depending on sail at all? That was a key question. Now, that was very important, because without considering that, we would not have today what we call scheduled shipping or scheduled crossings. Because before the steam engine was applied to ships, relying totally on the wind meant that you relied totally on the weather. And sometimes the wind blew and sometimes it didn't. That meant that if a ship left, say, Liverpool and was heading for Boston, you didn't know when it was going to get there. It could be 2 weeks or it could be 2 months. So you couldn't promise people in Boston that there was going to be a return trip to Liverpool. You just didn't know when. But with the steam engine, if you were driving the ship regardless of the weather, then you could have scheduled shipping. So it was truly a revolution. Well, the scientists of the time, I won't say the, but some scientists of the time, said that it was physically impossible, it was against the laws of nature, that a ship large enough to carry its own coal could be designed and built. They believed, and they maintained, and they lectured on the fact that the larger you make the ship, the more coal you needed to drive it, and therefore, you just have endless growth of ship without achieving your goal. Well, engineers in the 1830s thought otherwise, and they reasoned differently from the laws of nature. But the bottom line is that they built steamships that did cross under steam and carried enough coal to do it. And in fact, later they expanded that, but that would be another story for another time, because I did want to allow some time for questions. But just a few closing remarks, and that is that this is what the essential engineer is about. And the subtitle is, Why Science Alone Will Not Solve Our Global Problems. We need not only science, but we need engineering. We need a true partnership between them, and we need a recognition that there is an equal status of engineers and scientists in that they contribute differently, but they both contribute to the objective end, which is to effectively innovate and change the world. Well, thanks very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to answer questions. Start over here on the left.
Yes, I'd like your response to the conundrum and the controversy about the collapse of not two, but three towers at the eastern end of Manhattan 11 years ago this month, as if they were the products of planned demolition. Not only were two of these towers struck by airplanes, in addition, at least one other, another building as tall as either of the twin towers on this planet, and damaged as much as either of the twin towers, withstood the shock and remained standing. What are civil engineers saying about this controversy?
You're talking about, I believe, what is known as World Trade Center 7, the building that was hit by some debris and caught on fire and burned essentially almost overnight, as I recall, and eventually did collapse. The fact of the matter is that there was so much attention being paid to the World Trade Center towers proper, World Trade Center Tower 1 and 2, which were much taller than that World Trade Center 7 by a factor of roughly 2. That was not a big issue because people had been evacuated from that, and there was just not the same concern. But there are conspiracy theories about the fall of about the what did you call it, controlled demolition.
Yes.
I think generally civil engineers, structural engineers in particular, don't subscribe to those conspiracy theories. They believed, generally speaking, that all 3 towers collapsed largely due to 2 factors. One was that by the planes striking or the debris striking these structures, certain key structural elements were damaged, columns. If you take one of these poles out from under this tent, you don't expect the tent to be as strong as it is with all of its poles. And secondly, as the fires burned, they naturally generated heat. And the heat, if you heat up these columns here, they appear to be metal, they're going to get soft, and they're just not going to have the strength that they were intended to. So as a result, eventually the structure will collapse. There are reasonable structural engineering explanations for those collapses. Yes, sir.
As somebody who had his education and career in engineering physics, I'd be very interested in your comments on the convergence as we get into the nano region of both theoretical physics, let's say theoretical science, experimental science, and engineering. They seem to be coming together in this region.
Well, that's right. In order to produce, especially some of the electronic devices and components that are being projected, you have to know a lot of physics, and I think it's a good example of what I was saying, that there has to be close interaction. I will say that it's hard to predict what's going to happen or what are going to be the limitations because almost by definition we don't know what they are because we don't know as much about the science as we really should. They're still open questions. Yes?
Yes, the previous 2 speakers in this tent were dealing with different issues, be it farm-produced poultry and products. Edmund O. Wilson was here before. I think the key to bridging science and solutions is human factors engineering and the expansion of human factors engineering, but I haven't heard you speak on it. Would you have an opinion on that?
Well, I didn't mention it today. I have talked about human factors engineering. Human factors engineering has various definitions. To some people it means simply making machines that people can interact with, that humans can interact with without ambiguity and with safety. I think there are some attempts to broaden the idea of what human factors engineering means. And I think that's a good development. It's hard to be against something like that. And well, I think it bodes well for the objectives that we all have. Yes, sir.
Given the failures of this decade ending in 2010, what do you feel about universities, professors teaching engineers for the global warming changes, things that have come up, any challenges for the next decade so that we maybe don't have Katrina 2, Gulf spill 2, those type of things? Do you think we're prepared enough going forward?
Well, you know, Katrina sensitized people to the weakness of levees, and not only to the weakness of levees, but also to the weakness of the entire system that was supposed to help New Orleans respond to something of that nature. The Gulf spill, the recent Gulf spill, has sensitized people to deep water drilling and so forth. So these failures will have an immediate effect of making engineers and people that commission engineers a little more cautious, a little more conservative. So I would predict, if you're asking me to predict over the next decade, that we're not going to see another Katrina in New Orleans. We may see another Katrina elsewhere, because so many of the resources that it would take to bring levees elsewhere up to speed are really going to New Orleans. and there's just a limit to how many resources we can have. The Netherlands, which has had historically a levy problem, if you will, is thinking in terms of 200 years, and in some cases a millennium. They're very long-range thinking and action on a national scale. We haven't gotten to that point yet. So I think we really have to look elsewhere for some further lessons about what we can do to prevent disasters. Yes?
Professor, you wrote a book 11 or 12 years ago, The Book on the Bookshelf.
Yes.
And in that you discussed many of the themes you brought up today: invention, innovation, the profit motive. And in that context, I wonder if you would just address the evolution in publishing today of e-books and p-books.
I wish I
whatever
knew.
your comment.
There is so much being reported and written on that topic that I'll admit to being bewildered about what's happening. I think e-books are a natural development. Whether they will actually displace the physical book or not, I think remains an open question. And I think the publishers play more of a role in this than they seem to have admitted or seem to be acting upon. I think the publishers, in a certain way, are silent partners to the e-book revolution. It's a lot easier to produce and more profitable to produce an e-book than it is a regular printed book. I wish we would see more innovative thinking on the part of publishers with regard to e-books, and I simply haven't seen it yet. So I think that's going to be the next wave if the publishers are going to really fight what they claim they'd like to fight. They're largely fighting it on the basis of money and profit, but not in terms of technology, in my opinion. Yes, sir.
Yes, Professor, a lot of people here don't realize that you're one of the experts on failure analysis, and that you teach that at Duke. And my question is, the current modes of failure analysis we see now, that is the software failures, that is like the 1990 national telephone failure, I would say that is not so much between science and engineering, but a failure between high-level engineering or systems engineering and detailed engineering. Essentially, that failure was because they wanted to save money. They took the system engineering specs and they brought it into code instead of letting a software engineer develop the code himself. My question is I know your book is the merge science and engineering. What about in terms of failure analysis, what about systems engineering and detailed engineering?
Well, I'm getting the overtime sign, so I'll be very brief. And basically, I'm working on a book right now that deals with those issues. I'm interested in systems failures. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, but I've been told we have to keep on schedule.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.